So here we are, the 10 facts you probably didn't know about the Civil War, uncomfortable, dirty, and often not taught. Fact number 1. The Emancipation Proclamation wasn't issued until nearly 3 years into the Civil War. If the war was really over the maintenance and extension of slavery, then why wasn't the Emancipation Proclamation issued until 3 years in? What if the war had ended sooner? Fact number 2. There were Union states with slaves. The Emancipation Proclamation only freed slaves in rebelling states, which meant that Kentucky, Delaware, and West Virginia, Union states, all kept their slaves and sent thousands of men to fight the Confederacy. This is in large part because the Civil War was a war for Southern independence, in that it was a war to find out if the 11 Southern states would form their own country. Now, 4 of those 11 Southern states directly mention white supremacy in their Declarations of Independence and secession document. However, Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, fact number 3, was a racist. He is quoted to having said, "I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races, that I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people. And I will say in addition to this that there is a physical difference between the white and black races, which I believe will forever forbid the two races living together on terms of social and political equality." Lincoln says again, "I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so." Abraham Lincoln, President of the Union, says furthermore, "Our Republican system was meant for a homogeneous people. As long as blacks continue to live with whites, they constitute a threat to the national life. Family life may also collapse, and the increase of mixed breed bastards may one day challenge the supremacy of the white man." In 1860, America was a nation of whites. As is evidenced by the words of Lincoln himself, despite how uncomfortable it might be today, there was no magic line where people on one side weren't racist and the people on the other side were. Non-whites were not welcome to be American citizens, could not vote, and could not hold political office, North and South alike. If the South had remained in the Union, there would have likely been no war. This is because no one was trying to take the slaves away from the South. Northern commerce grew rich off import and export taxes from cotton, and northern industrial mills relied heavily on it for survival. Despite how contentious slavery was on the frontier, very few white Americans living in the North in the 1860s would have been willing to leave their families and farms to fight and die hundreds of miles away over people they viewed by and large as inferior. Northern armies made up of typical mid-19th century American males would have mirrored the race sentiments of their Southern counterparts. There were slave states who even sent men to fight and die in Union ranks during the war. For the first 3 years, the question of slavery was somewhat of an undecided side note, with the initial focus of the struggle being to determine whether or not the South would and could become an independent country. This war, with all its bravery and devotion on both sides, was, for fact number 4, the bloodiest in American history, totaling over 620,000 dead, more than every other American war combined. So who was the Confederate soldier causing all the fuss? Statistically, he was a white Southern male between the ages of 15 and 60. According to the Museum of the Confederacy, 89% of these men did not own a single slave, along with 75% of Southerners in general, although slaves helped the Army with manual labor, and the institution remained important to the South. A little known fact for our number 6, Native Americans sided heavily with the Confederacy. The last Confederate field commander to surrender was a Cherokee, Confederate General Stand Watie. Numerous Confederate officers were Native Americans as well, like Daniel McIntosh, a Creek Indian. Today, the Union side of the Civil War is celebrated for freeing America's slaves, but they were also committing a genocide at the same time. Native Americans were being raped, killed, and slaughtered en masse on the American frontier. As a side note, some of America's first black soldiers, the Buffalo Soldiers, helped to carry out this genocide of Native Americans and supplement a lack of expendable white manpower. Many Union generals, such as Custer and Fetterman, went on to slaughter and scalp Indians in the years immediately following the Civil War. Although often compared to Nazi Germany today, the Confederacy was not the side that supported a large authoritarian government, invaded foreign lands, and carried out a genocide. While there are obvious differences, there are also notable parallels between the German army in World War II, sweeping across the Russian plains, and the U.S. Army sweeping westward and killing Indians in droves with the concept of manifest destiny. After they were lied to, cheated, and had their land stolen by U.S. government officials, the Cherokee and other Native Americans found refuge in the new Confederate government and in the idea of an independent South, and threw themselves wholeheartedly into the Southern cause, accepting rank as senior officers and fighting until the absolute bitter end of the Confederacy. It's interesting to note for fact number 7 that while the South and the Confederacy in general are usually heralded as champions of slavery, not only did the Confederate Constitution ban the importation of slaves, meaning that no Confederate flag ever flew over a slave ship, but it allowed for the introduction of new states and territories into the Confederacy that were free and did not carry on the institution of slavery in any form. Fact number 8. Abraham Lincoln wasn't even on the ballot in any Southern state, but he still became president. This scared and angered Southerners, causing them to fear that their rights were being threatened and that they were systematically losing their ability to help determine the fate of their country. The North not only had a significantly larger population, but also was accepting streams of immigrants from foreign countries, many of whom were culturally alien. Furthermore, the culture of the North and South was drifting apart, rife with deep divides. The South was based on an agrarian way of life, and although there was significant farming in the North as well, the South possessed neither the industry nor the population density of the North. In Southern states, a deep sense of nativism and sectionalism was emerging in a society based on deep family ties and roots in the land. As increasing political divides emerged over issues such as slavery, government power, constitutional interpretation, and taxes, the rights of the Southern states to secede from the Union and form their own nation gradually came into question. In the South, very few were foreign-born, as most were old-stock Americans from the British colonies. Although the Confederates are often accused of being little more than slave-owning racist traitors, they believed that they were only finishing a process begun by their fathers in the Revolutionary War. The grandson of Patrick Henry, the man who said, "Give me liberty or give me death" to the British, was a Confederate officer. Robert Tyler Jones, grandson of a U.S. president who was born in the White House, carried a Confederate battle flag across a mile of open ground through continuous gunfire at the Battle of Gettysburg. Louis Armistead, a Confederate general famous for his leadership and courage, his uncle was the guardian of the Star-Spangled Banner in the Battle of Fort William McHenry in the War of 1812, the American flag that the national anthem is written about. Armistead later fought against his best friend, Northern General Winfield Hancock, at the Battle of Gettysburg. Robert E. Lee, the commanding Confederate general. His father was not only a lieutenant colonel in the American Revolution, but was a close personal friend of George Washington, and Lee married the daughter of George Washington's adopted son. It is interesting to note as well that both Vermont and Texas had already left the U.S. to become their own nations in the past, and had later rejoined the United States, which led most states to believe that secession was not only a totally acceptable option, but their right. After Lincoln's election, South Carolina voted in a storm to secede from the United States, dissolve her ties, and form a new nation, just as the Americans had done from the British in the Revolution. Shortly thereafter, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas chose to join her and take her back. In each of these states, former U.S. government holdings were peacefully turned over, but in Charleston, South Carolina, Fort Sumter was not. The Confederates, fearful of a large U.S. military fort in their most important harbor, repeatedly asked that the fort be either evacuated or turned over. Instead, Abraham Lincoln, ignoring multiple warnings from Southern troops, sent ships to resupply the fort. The Southerners, putting their money where their mouths were, opened fire and pounded the fort into submission in a shocking crescendo of fire from massive guns. Lincoln immediately issued a call for 75,000 volunteers to invade and subjugate the South, putting down the dangerous rebellion. Mobs rioted with U.S. soldiers across the country, hearkening back to the days when British soldiers had carried out the Boston Massacre. Hearing this, Lincoln then suspended the writ of habeus corpus, a constitutional right of Americans, meaning that American citizens could now be thrown in jail without reason and held indefinitely. In Maryland, freedom of speech was abolished, and U.S. troops collected the arms of the citizens. Fearing that Maryland would vote to join the Confederates, Lincoln had the entire state government thrown in jail. Lincoln then called for a blockade of every southern state, even North Carolina and Virginia, who had not yet left the Union. Upon hearing Lincoln's call for 75,000 troops and of the naval blockade, Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee voted in a landslide to leave the Union, raise an army, and join the Confederacy. They would not give Lincoln troops to send an American army to invade his own country, but above all, they would not allow Union soldiers to pass through their borders and make war on fellow Southern states. The die was cast for the bloodiest war in American history with a dare from the Confederate President Jefferson Davis. All that we ask is to be let alone. Fact number 9. The Confederate Army was created virtually out of nothing in much the same manner as the Americans in the Revolution. Volunteers stampeded to enlist, inspired by dreams of glory and convinced of the righteousness of forming a new country, arguing that the government derived its power from the people, and that in rebuking their consent to be governed, the natural law of liberty held them in the right, just as their forefathers. Some 200,000 eager young soldiers were enrolled in the first few months of the war. As in the North, regiments were mostly formed on a local basis under the leadership of either wealthy or educated officers, and company officers and NCOs were initially elected by the men. The Confederacy benefited, however, from a substantial corps of former U.S. Army officers who resigned to fight for the South, feeling loyal to the Confederacy. Jeb Stuart, Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, James Longstreet, John Bell Hood, Joseph E. Johnston, and many others were all former U.S. Army officers and graduates of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, who, though not without their mistakes, efficiently defended the South for 4 years. Union generals, on the other hand, threw away lives in costly campaigns as they advanced into the South and then were brutally beaten back, a prime example being General Ambrose Burnside, who led the Union to a tragedy at the Battle of Fredericksburg, attacking Confederates defending a Virginia town from behind a stone wall, with 13,353 Union casualties and only 4,576 Confederate casualties. Other such battles included First Bull Run, with 2,950 Union casualties to only 1,750 Confederate casualties, the Wilderness, with 18,400 Union casualties to only 11,400 Confederate casualties, the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse, with 18,000 Union casualties to only 12,000 Confederate casualties, or the Battle of Cold Harbor, with 13,000 Union casualties to only 2,500 Confederate casualties. Many were struck by the contrast between the rebels' ragged appearance and their courage. A woman who saw the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia on the march in late summer 1862 described the gaunt starvation that looked from their cavernous eyes, and commented that they could march or fight at all seems incredible, and yet these were the soldiers who checked the Union forces at Antietam and bled them white at the end of the war at Cold Harbor, Spotsylvania Courthouse, and the Wilderness. Given its shortage of manpower, the Confederacy in 1862 was forced to resort to conscription, but they succeeded in making the draft work better than the Union ever did. All white males aged between 18 and 35 were liable for military service, and no one could pay for a substitute to take his place. Many more who were older or younger volunteered. Confederate soldiers were predominantly farmers or farmhands, and unlike the Union troops, very few were foreign-born. It was widely agreed that the Southern soldiers fought with greater dash and enthusiasm than the stubborn, pragmatic Northerners. Their shrill rebel yells struck dread into the hearts of even the most veteran Union soldier during an attack. The Confederate soldier generally felt a greater commitment to the war than the average Union soldier. Confederates felt that they were fighting in defense of home and family and of their entire way of life. Lee expressed the feelings of most of his men when, in 1864, he declared, "If victorious, we have everything to hope for. If defeated, nothing will be left for us to live for." In the last 2 years of the war, with defeat looming, the Confederate Army was swept by religious revivalism, with many soldiers engaging enthusiastically in prayer meetings and hymn singing. No matter how many Yankees the Confederates could kill, They were losses that the Confederates could not replace. For every Yankee soldier shot down, another would appear, freshly equipped with shoes, bayonet, uniform, musket, ammunition, and rations. As the Yankees continued south, bombing Richmond and burning Atlanta to the ground, the cause became more and more desperate for the Confederacy as women were raped and families were killed, and the casualties became ever higher for the Union in the desperation of Southerners fighting more and more brutally. With the final surrender of Confederates in the East, Union commanders ordered that their men snap to attention to salute the Confederate soldiers for their absurd devotion, horrible losses, and intense bravery. For example, the 45th North Carolina began the war with 2,597 men and ended with only 88 men and 7 officers. Such was typical for the beleaguered Southern regiments who had been fighting constantly for 4 years. In the words of the Confederate President Jefferson Davis, "The war must go on until the last man of this generation falls in his tracks, unless you acknowledge our right to self-government. We are not fighting for slavery. We are fighting for independence, and that, or extermination, we will have."
Want somebody to be, answer if you can. I want somebody to tell me, what is the soul of a man? What is the soul of a man? I traveled different countries, I traveled foreign land. I found nobody could tell me, what is the soul of a man? What is the soul of a man? I saw a crowd stand talking, I just came up in time. The teachers and the doctors and the lawyers say a man ain't nothing but his mind. A man ain't nothing but his mind. Want somebody tell me, answer if you can. I want somebody tell me, what is the soul of a man? What is the soul of a man?